From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello everyone, welcome, and we are going to try to figure out today what you need to know to record a proper statement of responsibility according to RDA. My name is Melanie Polutta, and I am an LC cataloger, a NACO trainer, and was heavily involved in the RDA training process that went on a few years ago, as was this person.
Yes, I'm Tim Carlton. I'm in the Cooperative Instructional Programs Division of the Library of Congress, and I was one of the leaders in the development of LC's RDA training for bibliographic records, not so much with authority records, but with bibliographic records.
Well, we're looking at the statement of responsibility that's in the 245C subfield in a MARC record. So let's start off with a list of requirements. What is required? What is encouraged? What is optional? And what, if anything, is prohibited?
Well, that could get complicated, but I'm going to try to simplify it. Well, first of all, one thing to keep in mind is you can always record everything you see. That's always an option. And sometimes that's the easiest.
Mm-hmm.
I would sometimes joke when I was teaching LC people about statement of responsibility, more typing, less thinking. And if you want to just type everything you see, fine, you're not wrong. Mm-hmm. It might take you longer, but you're not wrong to do it that way. There is an important provision, though, in RDA 2.4.2.3 that says that you should give preference in the case of multiple statements of responsibility, and I'll elaborate on that in a few minutes, is that you give preference to those statements of responsibility which are actually statements of responsibility, and by that I mean this. They reflect the indication of who has been involved in the intellectual artistic work, not so much the proofreader or an in-house editor or an agency that simply funded the research. You may decide to record those as well, but those are not necessarily statements of responsibility. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second, so you have that out from the beginning, that not necessarily everything on the title page needs to be recorded. The RDA instruction, the core requirement, is that the first, and the wording is intentionally kind of particular. It states that the first recorded statement is required to be recorded, which I kind of like to paraphrase as, if you've decided this is a statement of responsibility, you're required to record the first of those statements that you decide are worth being recorded, which strikes me as somewhat circular logic, but it's an important distinction. Beyond that core statement of the first statement, you can give as many or as few as you wish, and we'll elaborate on that in a moment. Generally, whatever you record, you record in its entirety.
So that first one's required, so everything else after that is optional.
Correct.
Nothing really is prohibited. You can record everything you see.
Correct. The proviso is that you record it as it appears. The statement of responsibility is definitely a transcribed element. So whatever you record, you must record it as it appears, typos and all.
Okay. So let's take a momentary step back, because I really want to focus on a definition first. What is a statement of responsibility? You kind of address that somewhat. Is that really the definition?
Yes, there is a definition in the glossary, and I would paraphrase it to say it's a statement on the resource. First of all, it's important that it is on the resource, that indicates who is responsible, and that who could be a person, could be a family, or it could be a corporate entity. As the Supreme Court has told us, corporations are people. So an entity that is responsible for the intellectual or artistic content. And that would be a statement of responsibility, literally a statement of who is responsible. And you just keep in mind that the who doesn't necessarily mean a human being or a group of human beings.
Well, then beyond that, most catalogers recognize those.
Right, yeah, based on my experience, I think they recognize a statement of responsibility when they see it. I think what gets a little bit more confusing, and I think we'll elaborate on this in a few minutes, is when you have one statement or when you have multiple statements. For example, you might have one statement that says by Bob and Edith, and that's pretty clear, and that's one statement. Or even more simple, by Bob Smith. That's as simple as you can get. That's one situation. Another situation is when you have one statement, but it contains multiple entities doing multiple functions, and they are somehow grammatically linked by somebody with contributions by somebody else, and that with kind of grammatically links them together. I think with is kind of a fuzzy grammatical link. Some people consider it a grammatical link, and some people don't. My rule of thumb is if it says with what, then it's a grammatical link, and then it's a distinct situation. If it just says with, you don't really know. I had a cataloging instructor years ago who said that might just mean they stapled it together or ran it off on the, using very old terminology, because I'm very old.
Important
yes,
intellectual
very
or artistic
indeed.
contribution.
Yeah. Another situation is that you have different entities performing different functions, and they are not grammatically linked. Either, and actually I should point out that link does not necessarily have to be grammatical.
Yes,
it could be
just
grammatical,
layout.
it could be layout, it could be typography, it could be all three of those. That's a pretty much a no-brainer when you have that kind of a linkage.
Well, but that's
or a
one of the-
non-linkage.
That's one of the places where you're going to be exercising catalogers judgment all over the place. You have to interpret what you see.
And to get back to your first question, what is required, what is encouraged, what is optional, there is a lot of cataloger judgment in this beyond the core statement of record the first statement of responsibility.
Well, then, just to clarify one point here, you're making it clear, I think, that that first statement is what has to be recorded, not the first name. That one statement can include multiple names.
Right, exactly. And the other side of that coin is just because you have multiple names, that doesn't mean you have multiple statements. You know, essays by John Smith, Mary Jones, George White, and whatever, could be 45 different people. That could well be one statement. You want to look at, are they doing different functions? Are they making the same contributions? Now here I'm not talking about contributions in the RDA sense of an expression versus a creator who does work, but contributing to a work, little c contributing. So it's important to understand that a statement may name multiple people. On the other hand, it may name no persons. The scope note says that a statement of responsibility may not actually name a person. It also may not name a person in its entirety. It may mention just a last name.
Well, and that actually brings me to a question I sometimes have. Because you mentioned a statement is not necessarily connected grammatically, but the layout clearly indicates equal responsibility. Now, for example, I have seen title pages that have authors up here in italics, and right underneath it in this vertical list of last names only. Would I record those and consider them as one single statement?
Well, yes, I think you would. First of all, I think the last names only is kind of red herring. It really doesn't matter, as I mentioned a minute ago. The name is not necessarily given in its entirety. It may not even be included at all. But so that's a separate issue. But the situation you present, you suggest, I would say, is definitely a single statement of responsibility. You really want to kind of look at it and use your brain. And you're a human being. You can think, what is the publisher trying to convey here? And a listing of authors with a list of names. Well, I think they're trying to say this person and this person and this person are each authors of this thing. And so I would consider that a statement of responsibility, and I'd consider it a single statement of responsibility.
Okay, now let's backtrack to the optional thing. I can pick and choose. Well, I have to record the first one, and after that, can I pick and choose from the second and the third and the fourth statements of responsibility? Say I have looked at that list and said, okay, the first one's the author, very important. The second one's the illustrator. The third one's the editor. And I've decided that that illustrator just is not as important, even though he did artistic content. Can I skip his name in that second statement?
Sure. Let me answer the two ways. First in kind of the generic, and then one, again, addressing your specific situation. You can definitely pick and choose. Remember, first of all, the first thing is you have to decide, is this string of data a statement of responsibility? That, as you suggest, the second one, maybe it wasn't in the case you suggested, but it may actually not be a statement of responsibility. It may just indicate who the in-house editor at the publisher is. Or, again, it may be the person who stapled it together. Whatever. And so you can always leave that out. So you can pick and choose. So within that context of, first of all, what constitutes a statement of responsibility, and then putting that together with the core requirement that only the first is required, you can pick and choose. It's possible. I would have to say, though, and this is just my personal observation, I would personally tend not to do it. There is the principle of representation, which is record a statement of responsibility as a transcribed element as it appears on the source. that suggest in its entirety, although we'll get to some exceptions to that in a minute. To me, recording only some of the statements of responsibility that appear on the source is kind of like, to use a legal analogy, it's kind of like not telling the whole truth. You're not lying exactly, but you're not telling the whole story. You might be leaving out what someone might consider to be an important aspect. But again, that's my personal take. I would tend not to. There are times I would. If there are 23 statements of responsibility, you bet I would pick and choose.
So that could be an encouraged, perhaps,
Correct.
Policy.
Exactly.
Well, at least your personal encouragement.
My own personal encouragement. I don't make the policies, so you don't have to do it as I do it.
Well, let me actually confound you with a slightly different question. Let's say on my preferred source, the top in that listing, has just a last name, once again, but say on my secondary preferred source, I have a fuller form of that name. Can I replace that just last name only with a fuller form?
Well, technically you can't, and it's important to keep in mind that the preferred source is actually in RDA a list of multiple preferred sources. There are multiple sources. There is a ranked order, and the first one is the title page, or really whatever you decide is the title page.
For books.
Yes, and for a book, if the last name appears on the title page and a fuller form of the name, including the surname and maybe middle initial and a forename and everything else, appears on the verso or on the cover, you really are limited to the title page if any reference to that person, that entity, occurs on that first ranked source. I kind of think of it as the British parliamentary, the first among equals kind of situation. If it's on the title page, you have to stick with what's on the title page. That's not to say you can't bring out in a note the first name. But remember, the statement of responsibility is not intended to be a biography.
No.
The name authority record can handle some of that. That's not intended to be a biography either, but that's where you can bring out more information about this entity.
You can certainly add that fuller form of name from your lesser source. I guess secondary source would be okay, but second ranking in the preferred source.
There really is no such thing as a secondary source. I think sometimes people are concerned with making sure they've credited everybody properly. Well, that's not the point of the statement of responsibility. No. We're not movie agents. We're not concerned with that our actor gets their name on at the top of the marquee. That's not the point. You're trying to record who is responsible for this resource. And as we've talked about earlier, there is some judgment. The access point is where you would record the full name in, of course, the controlled form, last name, forename, middle initial, dates, titles, whatever is in the 1XX form in the authority record. That's not necessarily the purpose of the statement of responsibility.
It can help with that, but that's not
of course, yes. And access points are often based on the statement of responsibility, very often, but they're almost never in the exact same form, for the simple reason that they almost never are inverted in the form that occurs in an access point.
Of that.
That does happen.
It does
yes.
happen. Now, let me ask one extra question. What if I've got, say, okay, on my title page, I've got the statement of responsibility of the author, for example, but on my TP Verso or from some other, in the colophon perhaps, I've got a statement of a translator. Can I add that as a second statement of responsibility without indicating any bracketing or anything like that?
Yes, you could, because that would be one of the sources. It's not it is one of the preferred sources. It is not the first ranked of the preferred sources, but it is one of the valid preferred sources. So you could take a completely additional statement that appears on your verso that does not appear on the title page and add that to as what we used to call a subsequent statement of responsibility.
Such as a fuller name.
Exactly.
Okay, so how completely should you record your statement of responsibility? We've referred to this in its entirety comment and whether or not we record everything. Do we record everything?
Well, yeah, as I suggested earlier, there are some exceptions. The general principle is fully transcribe what you see. And again, that partially is my take on it, of not leaving anything out, not picking and choosing. But you can. In addition to picking and choosing statements of responsibility, the general principle is that each statement of responsibility would be recorded in its entirety. But there are a couple of exceptions to that. And these are covered in RDA 2.4.1.4 and 2.4.1.5. And it's important to understand that these address different situations, which I think some people lump together. 2.4.1.4 talks about omission of names, and that would be the situation such as you have 27 authors listed on the title page, and you just decide, oh, this is way too many. This relates to the rule of three, which is no longer in RDA. But in AACR2, where we would have mentioned only the first and then use the ellipsis and the bracketed et al. To indicate, hey, there's more people contributing to this resource. In RDA, the way you do that is you mention the first, you transcribe the first, and then you replace it with a bracketed, and it could obviously bracketed because you are supplying it, indication of what was omitted. So again, this is omitting names, and I said names, but of course that could be a person, it could be a family, it could be a corporate body, it could be a mix of those. Omitting an entity. And this addition that you give is a replacement of data. So it would be recorded in the language of the cataloging agency.
So for us here at LC, that would be English.
That would be English. So even if you have a French title and you only record the first of 12 authors,
I will still add and 11 others in English.
Others, not a 11 autres. I think I'm right about that.
Okay.
It's unlike, for example, adding the country of publication to the city of publication in the 264, where you are trying to match the language because you are adding to an element. This is a case where you are replacing an element. You're supplying something. So that's omissions, 2414. 2415 is very similar, but it has to do with abridging, and I want to be careful here, not abbreviating, but abridging. And that refers to things like deciding that you don't need to record things like PhD, like doctor, like Miss, like their university affiliations, their degrees, their positions.
Or all those societies that they may list with many initialisms.
Yes, exactly. And you can leave those off. I think it's important, and that's catalog. When do you leave it off and when don't you? There's no number given, either for omissions or abridgments. It's completely your judgment. You have to weigh, is the value of keeping them there, does that value outweigh the time it takes you to do it? Economy is one of the international cataloging principles. So if you're taking an extremely long time to record the statement of responsibility in one resource, you conceivably, and proofread it, and maybe do access points for them, you conceivably could be cataloging one or two additional resources in that time. And so then you're not providing as much access to the user for resources. So it's important to understand the difference in that. One more distinction between omitting and abridging. In the case of omissions, and that's again like saying something like and 12 others, in that case you do supply the indication of what was omitted, and that's what goes in the brackets. In the case of abridging, you just delete the PhD. You don't delete it. You fail to record the PhD and the university affiliation.
So
you don't have to say you left
ellipses
anything
or
out.
anything else
You
to
just leave it
indicate
out.
you
You don't
left
have
out
to
that
say that you
phrase.
left it out. Exactly.
Well, that simplifies that process, and certainly return on investment of time is one of those ongoing cataloger judgment decisions that every cataloger must look at. So what can I do on the opposite situation? Because just now we were talking about cutting out stuff that was there. What about if I look at this statement of responsibility and I have no idea what this person did? Can I add anything?
Sure. And I would say a general rule of thumb is you would add a clarifying term if what the general supposition would be is incorrect. In other words, if you have a statement that just mentions a person, and most people would look at that and think, oh, that's the author.
Yes.
If you look through it and you find out that person has actually edited essays by a lot of other people, then you would want to, not only you could, but I would say you should, supply a clarification in brackets of the function.
Now, would it be in
Edited
the
by.
English language or excuse me, language of cataloging agency or language of the resource?
In that case, you would match the language to the other language that is already there. So
not
if it's
always
in
English,
Italian, for
LC.
example, Acqua di Paolo, whoever or whatever, if it's an Italian resource, etc., you would match the language. And that's because there are not any specific instructions in the instruction about which language you use. So you would default to more general instructions in, I think it's 1.4, that says in this kind of a case, you match the language.
Okay.
Okay.
So we know that we're going to do that. Now, I have a question that is related to what we're discussing, but I think really it's a separate issue. Do I have to give access points for all the names that I list in a statement of responsibility?
Well, that's actually two separate questions, so you kind of answered your own question there, or started answering your own question. Recording a statement of responsibility is transcribing a transcribed element. You are reflecting what is on the piece. You are telling the truth about how the resource reads. Adding an access point, or multiple access points, is I won't say a completely different decision, but it's a different thought process. You could, as we suggested earlier, you could give an access point for somebody who isn't even named in the statement of responsibility. On the other hand, maybe more common, you decide not to record an access point, provide an access point for somebody who is recorded in a statement of responsibility. Let's say, for example, you've decided to record a statement of responsibility for the person who writes the foreword. Maybe it's a very well-known book reviewer or someone like that. And you decide, well, I want to get this person's name in the record somehow. Well, it's there. You can record it in the statement of responsibility. It's there. It's accessible by keyword. But you decide, I'm not going to give an access point for that person. You talked earlier about the case of an illustrator. I think that was your situation where you had 3 statements of responsibility. Mm-hmm. The illustrator was the second one. So I want to kind of delve into that one a little bit more deeply to get into what I think is a little bit of a confusion. As I think people know by now, there is a special requirement that the illustrators of resources intended for children, that the first of those entities must be given an access point. That's according to LC and PCC policy. That says the access point must be given as in the record. It doesn't require the statement of responsibility. And so you could leave off, in the example you gave, the statement of responsibility that names the illustrator, but still give the illustrator an access point. A lot of people think of this as the principle of justification. And there really is no need that an access point must be justified. It has to be intellectually. You don't give yourself an access point just because you catalog the work. You have to have had something to do with the resource. Not the record for the resource, but the actual the resource.
Artistic responsibility.
Intellectual artistic justification, and you can justify that many ways, of course.
You don't have to justify it by recording that name elsewhere in the record before you give the access point.
Right, and so they're really two different decisions. And that means you can go either way on that. I think it's important to understand that, especially with the fairly new introduction of relationship designators. You can often indicate what that person did by adding a relationship designator, editor, compiler, et cetera, et cetera. Illustrator is one that actually is required in the case of an illustrator for children. The E-subfield illustrator is required. So personally, if you've seen me type, it's not a pretty sight. I would tend to leave out the statement of responsibility naming the illustrator on a resource intended for children, because I know I have to give the access point anyway, and the access point has to include the subfield E illustrator that tells the world what this person did. I don't need to record it again in the statement of responsibility. I would probably tend to leave it out.
Whereas
that again is my personal, yes, indeed.
Absolutely judgment, because I would probably.
Well, I've seen you type, yes, and you're considerably more accomplished.
Well, this has been very interesting, and I've certainly learned a few things about the statement of responsibility and exercising my judgment. So, as we conclude, is there perhaps one thing that you'd like the listeners to remember?
Well, I think it would be to understand the core requirement. And the fact that, first of all, there is a bare minimum, and there is a core requirement, and that, again, is to record the first of those statements that you decide is a statement of responsibility must be recorded. Beyond that, it's all cataloger judgment. You can record whatever you wish. If you record a statement, record it in its entirety, generally, one of my favorite words from the policy statements, and the generally there refers to the omission and the abridgment that we talked about earlier. But let me ask you, as a practicing cataloger, what is your breaking point or your decision factor about when you decide to record it and when you do not?
Well, partly it has to do, I think, with do I want to give responsibility to that person? And as you mentioned, I sometimes will give a name in the statement of responsibility when I know I'm not going to give the access point, because I don't want to go to the work of doing the authority record, because that is the most expensive and time-consuming part of cataloging, whereas just typing in the name doesn't take me near so long. But I do have my break points where I'm not going to say 10 or more names, although sometimes that can be affected how tired I am.
And I would say the judgment often comes down to, it really goes back to the Ferber user tasks. And I always ask myself, not just with statements of responsibility, but with every element, if I decide to record this in the record or not, how does that help or hinder a user find, identify, select, or obtain the resource?
Yes.
That's really what it comes down to. When we talk about cataloger's judgment, what do you base your cataloger judgment on? It's really the Ferber user tasks. Or the Fred
I do
user
find
tasks.
that the longer that 245 field gets, the less likely I am to type it all.
Indeed. Indeed. I understand that.
So thank you for watching us, and I hope this was informative for you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.